evening. It is Friday, May 22nd, 2020, and it is 6 p.m. in the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., and you are tuned to the Critical Hour here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist, Dr. Wilmer Leon, and for the next hour, we will explore and analyze the salient news stories that are impacting the global village in which we live. Baltimore Mayor Bernard C. Jack Young is urging President Donald Trump to reconsider his planned visit to the Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine on Memorial Day in Baltimore, in light of the stay-at-home order in place in the city to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Quote, "I wish the president, as our nation's leader, would set a positive example and not travel during this holiday weekend," Young said in a statement yesterday. This after pictures of Donald Trump wearing a mask after his Ford factory visit row. The president says he did not want to give press the pleasure of seeing him in a face mask. It's unfortunate that following the science and the recommendations from the CDC has become almost like a test of wills. I did not wear a mask because I did not want to give the press the pleasure of seeing me in a mask. I didn't do what was right because I didn't want the press seeing me doing the right thing. That doesn't make any sense. This while the virus spreads. We now have in the United States 1.61 million confirmed cases. That's up by 25,017 from yesterday. Fortunately, 309,000 people have recovered. And unfortunately, 95,213 people have died. That's up by 1,286 from yesterday. It's Friday, so we're going to kick off today's show the way we do every Friday with my first guest. He's a frequent collaborator with all major news outlets and author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, Caleb Maupin. As always, Caleb, welcome back.
Sure, glad to be here as always.
So let's start with Taiwan. The U.S., it is reported, is to sell Taiwan $180 million of torpedoes, and this isn't making China very happy. The U.S. State Department has approved a possible sale to Taiwan of 18 Mark 48 Mod 6 advanced technology heavyweight torpedoes and related equipment for an estimated cost of $180 million. Your thoughts on this and what else is going on relative to Taiwan?
Well, I'm anxious to talk about this because the way Taiwan is framed in American media is very, very distortive of the actual situation there. And that it comes across in American media, you would think that, that Taiwan is somehow an independent country, that, China is colonizing them or something to this effect. That's just completely inaccurate. What's going on here is for thousands of years, we're talking thousands of years, long before, Christopher Columbus came to the United States, Taiwan was part of China. Thousands of years it's been part of the Chinese civilization. It wasn't until 1895 when Japan colonized and made Taiwan into a dependency. That's when Taiwan was broken away from China. And when Japan, who was our enemy during the Second World War, when they occupied Taiwan, they worked very, very hard to erode the culture of the people of Taiwan, to make them Japanese, right? They forced the Japanese language on the people of Taiwan. They did a lot to try and erode the Chinese roots of Taiwan. And after the Second World War, Japan lost in the Second World War. Taiwan was returned to China. Then you had, the civil war between the communists and the KMT nationalists. The communists, established the People's Republic on the mainland. And so the KMT nationalists set up shop in Taiwan, called themselves the Republic of China. And even to this day, the name of Taiwan is the Republic of China. And Taiwan recognizes itself as a Chinese island, right? It may have a different government than the mainland, but it is Chinese. The people of Taiwan are Chinese. However, if you look at this so-called independence movement in Taiwan, the Taiwan separatists, the folks that want to break it away, most of them, they call themselves Taiwanese natives, but they are actually the descendants of Japanese occupiers. and look into it. The strongholds, the most outspoken voices in Taiwan that are advocates of declaring Taiwan to not be Chinese, breaking Taiwan away from the mainland, declaring that Taiwan is not China. They're themselves not natives of the island. They themselves are the descendants of Japanese settlers and occupiers. This would be akin to like in South Africa. The white Afrikaners declaring that that South Africa is not part of Africa. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? And that this is they're framing it as if China is the aggressor here, and that's just completely false. During the Second World War, everyone looked in horror at the crimes that Japan committed. Japan committed crimes against the Korean people. It committed crimes on the Chinese mainland. It committed crimes all throughout that region. And in Japan, there is a huge effort to rewrite that history and to kind of ignore that and to make it sound like Japan wasn't so bad during the Second World War. There's a huge effort on the part of right-wing militarists in Japan to do that. And, the notion of breaking Taiwan away, saying that Taiwan is not part of China, that fits in with that, colonizer, racist, World War II historical revisionist narrative. It's really, really similar to what's been going on in Eastern Europe, where in Eastern Europe, in countries like Poland and Ukraine, you have the destruction of World War II memorials, the iconification of pro-Nazi forces that fought in the Second World War. There's a whole effort going on to erode the actual history of Eastern Europe, to erode the actual history of Asia, and to try and rewrite the history of the Second World War and basically ignore the fact that the Second World War was a beautiful moment where the United States, Britain, China, the Soviet Union all stood together against fascism. And what horrifies me is that right now, the U.S. government seems to be working very, very hard to rewrite the historical narrative in favor of the fascists, whether it's the Japanese fascists in Asia, who both of my grandfathers fought against, or whether it's in Eastern Europe, in favor of the forces across Eastern Europe that aligned with Nazis and Italian fascists. This is a bizarre thing because the United States is involved in this geopolitical game of trying to escalate a confrontation with Russia and China. They're rewriting the history of the Second World War. They're rewriting the borders of countries around the world. They're playing up, fascistic and right-wing nationalist historical narratives. This is all very dangerous. And what's going on with Taiwan fits right into this.
Are there U.S. so-called democracy organizations that are afoot within Taiwan, either directly or indirectly, as you will find these organizations in Venezuela, as you will find these organizations in other countries around the world? Basically, we're finding them, I believe, in Hong Kong, either through directly funding and or providing individuals to stir this pot?
Oh, of course. And the DPP, the party in Taiwan that favors independence and breaking Taiwan away, declaring that Taiwan is not part of China, is seen as a pro-U.S. party, so much so that before Trump took office, when Trump was not yet the president, when he was the president-elect, Trump spoke on the phone to the leader of the DPP, the representative of that party. And that was a big deal because in order for China and the USA to have relations, you'll remember that Henry Kissinger arranged for the United States to support China on the Taiwan issue, right? That for a long time, the United States had recognized the government on Taiwan, the Republic of China, as being the entire Chinese government. But then Henry Kissinger arranged for Richard Nixon to go to China and meet with Mao, and arranged also for the United States to recognize Taiwan as being, part of China, and recognizing that the People's Republic of China had, dominion over Taiwan, and recognizing the People's Republic of China as the legitimate government for all of China, which the United States did not do, let's remember, and the UN didn't do. For many years, Taiwan represented all of China on the UN and at the UN Security Council, and that was not right. But it was efforts by the Soviet Union, it was efforts by Henry Kissinger primarily, who made the deal, arranged for a kind of a rapprochement where it was allowed that finally the United States would recognize the People's Republic and recognize Taiwan as part of China, and that's been the policy. And the Trump administration, they haven't gone as far as to, overturn that. Their anti-Chinese rhetoric is escalating. The sale of weapons to the government on Taiwan has escalated. But so far, we have not seen them attempt to go as far as to erode erode official recognition. But if they did that, that would be a huge, huge slap in China's face, and it would be a provocation, essentially. But let's remember that trying to break down the notion of one China has been consistent U.S. policy since the Chinese Revolution. In the 1950s, the United States sent thousands of soldiers into Tibet, armed, with weapons, sent them into Tibet to wage a civil war against the People's Republic. Over 100,000 people died. It was a bloody civil war. And the folks that were fighting against the invaders were largely monks and religious folks who'd been trained by the United States in Colorado and by the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. military. But it was actually Tibetans themselves who fought against the invaders, against the civil war makers, because the Chinese Communist Party was raising the Tibetan people out of serfdom. And that's why, you'll notice there was an incident a few years ago where there was a soccer game in Germany, and Tibet separatists came and waved the Tibet flag, and some Chinese soccer players were there. They refused to play until that flag was taken down. And everyone said, oh, that's outrageous. They're violating the free speech. Well, I'm sorry. There was a civil war, to end feudalism and slavery, in which over 100,000 people died. That would be the equivalent of somebody showing up at a basketball game in the United States and waving the Confederate flag. That would not be acceptable, right? When you have a war to end slavery in which thousands and hundreds of thousands of people die, the symbol associated with trying to break apart the country to preserve feudalism and serfdom is pretty offensive. And Tibet separatism is also pretty offensive. Hong Kong, the United States is dedicated to breaking apart the notion that there is a Chinese nation, there is a Chinese state, whether it's in the Uyghur regions, whether it's in Tibet, whether it's in Hong Kong, whether it's with Taiwan. The United States is determined to break down the unity of the people living in China, because if it can erode that unity, it can play into the idea that they're different, they have historic differences, they need to be broken apart, they need to be fractured. This is a way for huge American corporations and Wall Street to come in there and take them over, divide and conquer. And that's what's trying to happen. They're trying to divide the peoples of China. There are independent nationalities in China, Tibetans, Uyghurs. There are other nationalities in China. Han Chinese are not the only nationality, and there are national minorities. And the Chinese Communist Party has done a lot to represent and give autonomy and representation to those minorities. But breaking down the notion of a China, destroying the notion of a China has been, the U.S. agenda since 1949. They seem to be backing away from it in the 1970s, but now that is very well alive. And it's not good for China. It's not good, I don't think, for the United States to foment unrest and wars and fighting in that part of the world. It's not a good thing. We want unity in the world. We don't want ethnic hatred and rivalry. But it mirrors what happened in Eastern Europe. As the time the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia were being destroyed, the United States tried to play up as much, the differences between the nationalities there, and foment bigotry between Muslims and Christians, between different ethnic groups, play up the idea that Poles and Russians are enemies, that Ukrainians and Russians are enemies. It was to divide the peoples of Eastern Europe in order to destroy them all with economic neoliberalism. And that's what happens when you break people down, when you play up the differences between each other, you foment ethnic bigotry and resentment and hate. When you do that, the result is people being weakened and impoverished.
Secretary of State Pompeo calls the Chinese plan to exert what he calls sweeping controls in Hong Kong a quote-unquote death knell for the territory's autonomy. To your knowledge, and you've just elaborated on a lot of this, but specifically looking now at what China's doing in Hong Kong, what is China actually doing? Are they, in fact, abandoning the one country, two systems approach? And will this be, as Pompeo said, a death knell for Hong Kong's autonomy?
No, I think if anything, what's going on there, which has the support, many different cultural associations in Hong Kong, many representative groups among the population, among government officials, support China's move. But let's be clear, what's going on there is essentially that China is going to enforce the law in Hong Kong, right? You aren't going to be able to cross the border, go into mainland China, break the law, and then not be extradited back to the mainland, right? That China gives a lot of economic support and a lot of investment to Hong Kong, and there's been some pretty ugly unrest there. They make it in the United States look like these are just peaceful protesters who don't do anything wrong, but videos have surfaced of them lighting people on fire, beating up tourists, beating up people who disagree with them, being very violent, destroying property, doing things that I'm sure they wouldn't have tolerated Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter doing in the United States. There's been a lot of violence on the streets of Hong Kong recently. And in light of that, China is working with the government in Hong Kong to make sure that kind of instability and unrest doesn't continue, and to do what the whole controversy is about from the beginning, which is make sure that if you break the law in the Chinese mainland and go back to Hong Kong, that you can be, extradited back to China to face charges for it in China. It's pretty simple. If Hong Kong is part of China, which it is, right, it's no longer a British protectorate. It does not belong to the British. That was given up long ago. It belongs to China. If Hong Kong is part of China, China has the right to enforce Chinese law in Hong Kong, and that's the issue.
That's pretty simple. And unfortunately, it has become so twisted and contorted that folks have really lost sight of what a lot of this is really all about. Moving to a different part of the world, looking at Venezuela and Iran, two countries that the United States has decided to make adversaries, and they both are being sanctioned by the United States, hobbled by the coronavirus. We now have reportedly 5 tankers full of Iranian gasoline that are on their way to Venezuela. And the first ships, I believe, are set to arrive over this weekend to alleviate some of the fuel shortages that the people of Venezuela are experiencing. Your thoughts on this? And because according to U.S. Special Representative to Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, quote, you have 2 pariah states finding that they are able to exchange things they need for things they have, end quote. Pariah states? Who have either of these governments attacked recently? Your thoughts, Caleb Maupin.
Well, here's the thing. The United States has worked so hard to isolate Venezuela, right? There is Venezuelan money in British banks that's been frozen. Billions of dollars have been seized from banks. There's been huge sanctions imposed on the country. They've done the same thing to Iran, right? They had the Iran nuclear deal. Trump pulled out of it. All kinds of sanctions are imposed. I mean, both countries are being economically strangled by the United States. The way these sanctions work is if you do business with Venezuela, if you do business with Iran, the United States will not do business with you or will impose harsh penalties on you for doing so when you trade with the United States. I mean, it's economic warfare against both of these countries. The United States has been working very, very hard to economically isolate 2 countries. So when 2 countries that are facing very, very similar embargoes, sanctions, economic warfare, want to trade with each other because the United States is threatening anybody who will trade with them, what jurisdiction does the United States have in it, right? If you stop trading with somebody and stop trading with somebody else, if those 2 people want to trade with each other, what's the problem? What right does the United States have to interfere with Iran and Venezuela exchanging supplies, exchanging goods, exchanging services? It doesn't make any sense. It does not make any sense. It really is a flagrant violation of the sovereignty of both of those countries. That's all it is. But the USA has no regard for Iran's sovereignty, and it has no regard for Venezuela's sovereignty. I mean, the USA does not recognize either of those governments. The USA, is working to foment unrest in both of those countries. The United States very much, seeks to destabilize and overthrow the governments of both Iran and Venezuela. So, we shouldn't really be surprised by this. What is interesting is that the Iranian government comes from the, Islamic tradition, right? Khomeini, the Islamic Revolution of Iran, which was very much a religious and conservative revolution. Meanwhile, the Maduro government, right, that comes out of Hugo Chavez, Bolivarianism, very much a Marxist government. What's interesting is, these are governments that when they were formed were on opposite sides of the political spectrum. But it seems now they get along quite well. And the rhetoric of the leaders is quite similar, right? Maduro, despite being a Marxist, is also Roman Catholic. And he talks about, the Bible and the need to break with Western capitalism and, put people before profits, being in line with his faith. The leaders of Iran are Muslims and very religious, but they talk about the evils of capitalism and the need for an economy to serve the people and rejecting Western individualism and the rule of corporations and such. If you read the Ayatollah, the supreme leader Khamenei's writings, he sounds very similar to Maduro. And we have two people that in the Cold War where it would have been on the opposite sides of the political spectrum, but they seem to be on pretty much the same page. I mean, one's Muslim, one's Christian, but they both are opposed to capitalism. They're both opposed to Western imperialism, and they're cooperating with each other. And it shows how politics and material forces in the world, economics more than anything, will drive people in different parts of the world and different political ideologies, different historical traditions, different religions together out of economic necessity.
Caleb Maupin, as always, man, smoking. Really appreciate your time today. That was phenomenal analysis, as always. And stay safe. Have a wonderful weekend. Look forward to having you back.
Sure thing. Same to you. Best wishes.
Thanks, buddy. All right, folks, you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Dr. Wilmer Leon. There is more on the other side. Stay tuned.